the late 10th century, when England was still fragile enough that a single violent death could tilt the balance of the entire kingdom, a teenage king rode into a Dorset estate and never rode out again. His reign lasted less than 3 years, yet the consequences of his killing echoed for generations, shaping how power, sanctity, and legitimacy were understood in early medieval England. King Edward, later called the Martyr, did not rule long enough to leave behind great laws or victories, but his death became one of the most politically and spiritually charged moments in Anglo-Saxon history. To understand why, one must look not only at how he died, but at the world of rival elites, church reform, and contested memory that surrounded his brief life. You almost certainly mean King Edward the Martyr reigned 975 to 978, the teenage Anglo-Saxon king whose killing at Cough became one of the most politically loaded deaths in early English history. People sometimes mix him up with Edward I Longshanks, but the martyr title belongs to the 10th century Edward, son of King Edgar. Edward was born into a royal house that had recently made England feel unusually together. For the early medieval period, his father, King Edgar the Peaceful, had spent the 960s-970s tightening royal authority, cooperating with powerful churchmen and backing a sweeping monastic reform movement. That reform matters because it created winners and losers among the elite. Some magnates and bishops benefited from reformers' influence and monastery building. Others resented land transfers and the reformers' growing reach. By the time Edgar died in 975, the kingdom's political temperature was higher than it looked from the outside, and Edward's succession dropped straight into that tension. Edward's claim had strengths and weaknesses at the same time. He was the elder son of Edgar, which made him the natural heir in many people's eyes. But he was also young, likely in his early teens when crowned, and the identity, status of his mother is less politically neat than later royal genealogies prefer. Meanwhile, Edgar had another son, Ethelred later the Unready, younger but backed by a formidable political figure, his mother Queen Elfrith, also spelled Elfrith, Elfrida. When Edgar was alive, the question could be managed. Once he died, the question became a contest over who would control the court, the church, and the flow of patronage for the next decade. The sources we have are thin and sometimes written with hindsight, but they consistently imply that Edward's accession was disputed, and that the dispute was driven less by the boys themselves and more by rival adult networks. Two blocks are often sketched by historians because they show up again and again in the narrative tradition. On Edward's side, Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Thowine, Ealdorman of East Anglia. On Thelred's side, Queen of Thryth and Ethelwold, Bishop of Winchester. That pairing matters because Dunstan and Ethelwold were towering Reform-era churchmen, but they were not aligned on everything, and their allies had different local power bases. So the succession crisis is not just a family story. It's a lens on how power really worked through personal followings, control of estates, influence over appointments, and the ability to frame legitimacy in religious language. Edward did become king. His reign is usually dated from July 975 to the 18th of March 978, but it was short enough that almost everything about him gets interpreted through the filters. The political struggle that surrounded him and the cult that grew after his death. Even the documentary record reflects that. Very few royal acts survive compared with other periods, which encourages the impression that royal authority was contested or managed by great men around him. That doesn't automatically mean Edward was powerless. Survival of documents is always patchy, but it does mean we see the reign through a keyhole, later chroniclers, scattered charters, and monastic memories that had their own agendas. Then comes the event that defines him, his killing at Cough. The simplest core that most accounts agree on is this: Edward traveled to an estate associated with his stepmother of Thryth in the Cough area of Dorset, and there he was attacked and died on the 18th of March 978. Some arguments exist for 979, but 978 is the dominant date in modern treatments. He was very young, often said to be about 16 at death, and his half-brother Ethelred became king. What we cannot recover with certainty is the exact choreography and responsibility. Later medieval storytelling loves a clear villain, the wicked stepmother ordering murder, so her son can rule. But early medieval politics is usually messier. Households, retainers, local grudges, and opportunistic nobles all had reasons to act once they believed the wind was changing. Some versions of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle tradition and later retellings explicitly present Edward as martyred, which already signals that the narrative has shifted from political report to moral framing. In other words, the more saintly the Edward becomes. The more the death story becomes a stage for lessons about treachery, innocence, and divine justice. That does not mean the core event is fictional. It means the meaning of the event was contested, and the written tradition is part of that contest. After the killing, Edward's body was buried at Wareham, then later moved to Shaftesbury Abbey, and over time, he became venerated as a saint, hence the martyr. The movement translation of a body is not a neutral act in medieval England. Translating relics publicly could unify supporters, advertise miracles, and crucially declare that the dead person's cause had been righteous. If Edward was a saint, then those who opposed him or benefited from his death lived under a shadow. That shadow matters because Thelred's reign was long and difficult, later associated with Viking pressure and internal strain. The existence of a martyr predecessor offered church writers a way to explain misfortune. As consequence and warning, scholars have devoted serious attention to how Edward's cult functioned politically during Thelred's reign and beyond. One especially potent motif appears in later reports when Edward's body was disinterred. It was said to be found in remarkably good condition, a sign interpreted as holiness. Whether that detail is literal truth, pious embellishment, or a mix, the important historical point is that communities used the story to authorize Edward's sanctity and to embed it in local ritual life at Shaftesbury. The abbey itself was a major religious house, and saints' cults were not only spiritual assets, but also economic and political ones, drawing pilgrims, gifts, and prestige over the centuries. Edward's shrine and memory rose and fell with English religious change. Like many medieval shrines, it suffered during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1500s, when monastic institutions were dismantled and their treasures dispersed. Yet Edward's story didn't simply evaporate into legend, because there were also modern episodes that revived public interest. Remains associated with Edward were reportedly rediscovered in the 20th century, examined, and later became the subject of controversy over custody and veneration. Another reminder that relics are never just bones, but symbols people argue about. If you want something that feels like a documentary window into how this story is told on screen, there is a specific film item available through the BFI player titled King Edward the Martyr, 1979. Its framing is explicitly commemorative. Communities endorse it. In Somerset, honoring the reburial tradition, and it retells the familiar sequence: teenage king, visit to cough, murder, burial, and the saintly interpretation attached to the later treatment of the body. There are also shorter, popular history video explainers, for example an animated English monarch's video on YouTube that summarize the reign, assassination, and later relic history. These are not academic sources, but they show what the standard narrative looks like in modern public history. To understand Edward deeply, it helps to treat him as the center of three overlapping stories rather than a single biography. First is the story of a child king in a political system where adulthood, land, and armed followings mattered more than the crowned head's personal will. In that story, Edward is less an independent actor and more a prize and a banner, important precisely because whoever could act in his name could shape appointments and rewards. Second is the story of late 10th century church reform and aristocratic rivalry, where aligning with one candidate for the throne can also mean aligning with a whole program of landholding and religious policy. Third is the story of memory. Once Edward was treated as a martyr, the meaning of 978 could be retold again and again to serve later needs: local identity at Shaftesbury, moral instruction in chronicles, and political theology during hard times. That last layer, memory, often trips people up because it's tempting to ask, so who did it? The way we ask about a modern crime. The historian's honest answer is that the written sources are not a courtroom transcript. They are fragments and narratives shaped by communities with loyalties. But you can still reach firm, historically useful conclusions. One is that Edward's death was not treated as an ordinary change of ruler. It was quickly invested with moral and religious significance, martyred, which implies that enough influential people believed the manner of his death was scandalous, or at least politically exploitable.